Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Episode 39 of Season 2. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. I apologize for the audio quality, fighting through a bit of a cold. With the midterm election on the horizon in just a few days, I decided to do an episode that touched on election issues but didn't touch on them directly. I'm not going to sit here and have an episode that does a breakdown of different races and candidate strength and different national issues. That stuff gets boring because it's all so routine. It's all so repetitive. And it's looking at these elections under a microscope when if you look at the broader trends, you actually can pick up on the fact that neither party is really winning. It's really who is losing. Who are we voting against, not who are we voting for? In that vein, I discuss crime in terms of inflation and recession, not as a phenomenon independent of those things. We can, at the polls, dear listener, solve all the problems in this country, and we can do so by voting against the incumbent. The Ministry of Truth, the Disinformation Governance Board, strikes back, and a little fan service for the University of Tennessee volunteer football team as they head to Athens, Georgia. Thank you for all of the support. Thank you to all of my listeners. I do appreciate it more than you probably understand, as this is still a passion project, and all of the attention that I get is very meaningful. Please like, subscribe, thumbs up, write a review, distribute to people far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. If you like what you hear, please support. Without further ado.
Act 1. Inflation, Recession, and Crime.
Dire economic times bring on higher levels of crime. It's that simple. One of the most naive questions, one of the most simplistic answers. When you see tough economic times, you see recession, you see inflation. People are either unemployed or underemployed. Two things happen. One, crime rates skyrocket. Two, people die. The mortality rate increases. People should be rightfully concerned about crime. Whenever it goes up, it's obviously going to be a threat, particularly for people with young children, families. And just like young parents, just like any parent, you don't want to hear the squabbling between your kids, who was right, who was wrong, who started it. You want it to stop. You want the conflict to stop. You want peace. You want security. Naturally, I can't throw in the we. I can't throw in a plural pronoun because I do not have any kids. I don't see these threats the same way that a parent would. In these dire economic times, with crime soaring, we have routinely, historically enacted policies, laws that did not in any way, shape, or form affect crime, didn't affect the crime rate. You can always see a correlation between the reduction in crime with the rejuvenation, if you will, of the economy. When things start to pick up, when there's less inflation, when recessions abate, and you actually see a strong economy, when there's a strong middle class. I felt compelled to do a piece on this because there's political ad after political ad about the rising crime rate, blaming that on Democrats. And maybe rightfully so. The party in power should bear the brunt of the responsibility if the crime rate is going up. But the crime rate is not going up arbitrarily. It's not because of some lax policy by some district attorney, or there's some governor out there freeing drug addicts who are going out murdering randomly. There aren't immigrants illegally coming over the border, freely committing crimes. These are all nonsensical narratives, scare tactics. It's simple. You can look throughout the course of not only history in this country, the United States of America, but you can look throughout world history, all first world nations throughout the course of time. When recessions hit, when inflation in particular hits, crime skyrockets and the mortality rate skyrockets. People die as a result. We can't fix a problem, dear listener, if we don't know what the source is. If we continue to employ the same kind of thinking that led us into the problem, we're just going to create more problems. You can't develop a solution using the same type of thinking as you did to create the problem. In episode 37 of this very podcast, just 2 episodes ago, I noted that inflation is bullshit. Inflation is bullshit because although you can attribute to a small degree the supply chain issue or the war in Ukraine to the inflation that we're suffering here in this country, the cause for higher prices is simply corporations gouging us. That's right. Corporations see it as an opportunity, they gouge us. In order to tame inflation, politicians, of course, make up excuses and they defer to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve does the only thing that it can do, and that's raise interest rates. Lo and behold, the Federal Reserve just raised interest rates again this week, another 75 basis points. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates in the hopes that by taking dollars out of your pocket, by reducing your spending power, you will spend less, the economy will slow down, and inflation will subside. For all intents and purposes, the Fed drives the economy into a recession. When inflation combines with recession, crime skyrockets. The mortality rates skyrocket. Do you see now, dear listener? Is the little mouse wheel in your head spinning? The type of thinking that leads us into an inflationary period and into a recession is not the type of thinking that we employ in order to curb, if you will, the rising crime rates. Now, I know the Fox News in you, dear listener, might be coming out and saying, well, what about San Francisco? What about LA? What about these places where criminals can go in and just steal up to a certain amount and they won't even be prosecuted? Crime is not just skyrocketing in the state of California. Crime is not just skyrocketing in the city of San Francisco or the city of Los Angeles. Crime is on the rise nationwide. Using by way of example some of the dumbest policies that have been enacted by district attorneys in a state where, based on everything that's being done as far as public policy and government, you could truly call an outlier, that's not what's going on nationwide. California is not the bellwether of criminal activity or criminal behavior and criminal prosecution nationwide. My concern here, dear listener, for doing this piece is that there have been recessionary periods over and over again throughout the course of history, particularly in this country, and in light of those periods, there have been huge spikes in crime. And as a response to this, we've given to prosecutors, we've given to police immense power. We've imprisoned tens of millions of people. And what has it gotten us? We imprison more people in the United States of America than Stalin did during the worst days of the Red Purge in Soviet Russia, when he was imprisoning anyone that he could get his hands on. The Ukrainians, the Jews, Uzbeks, whoever he could get his hands on in order to consolidate his power. Oh, that's right, dear listener. Check your Google machine. There are more prisoners in the United States of America in the year of our Lord, 2022, than there were in Stalin's prisons in the 1930s, the 1940s, or the 1950s. If crime is skyrocketing now in the wake of the fact that we've had this explosion in the prison system in this country over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, it's a total indictment of that system. If that system actually worked to reduce crime, what's going on now that it's not working? Don't give me this cash bail bullshit that there's all these jurisdictions where they're no longer requiring cash bail. Cash bail is not the reason why crime is going up. Most of the people who are incarcerated because they can't make bail have committed low-level misdemeanors. They've committed low-level crimes. They aren't the people who are going out murdering and raping. Murderers and rapists don't get a reasonable cash bail. If you've got a cash bail for $2,000, you didn't go out and commit murder. You didn't go out and rape. And don't tell me it's the immigrants. Don't tell me you're going to get back on the immigrants thing. Oh, those lousy immigrants. You might find, one or two circumstances that you can plaster all over a political ad for 2 or 3 months. The statistics just don't bear it out. So yes, we may actually elect some folks who say they're going to be tough on crime. They will enact policies, I'm sure, that look on paper to be tough. Isn't that what we really want out of our politicians? For them to be bold in talk and tough on paper. The reality is the crime will not abate until there is an uptick in the economy and there does not appear to be that bright shining light at the end of the tunnel for quite a long time, because the Fed will continue to raise interest rates and drive this country further into a recession. I say it all the time on this podcast, dear listener, it's us. If we don't know any better, if we don't know well enough what the causes of the problems are, we can't actually elect people who can implement effective solutions. The same thinking that created the problem is not going to implement a solution. In fact, it's going to create greater and greater problems. Now, here's the tricky part, dear listener. I believe that I've set forth a short yet cogent argument as to why crime has increased based on history, based on data, and I feel like I've given a good enough warning to anyone that's willing to listen to this, that following the same path that's been followed time after time, decade after decade, millennia after millennia, it's not going to work. My problem, and I'll take responsibility for this, I don't know what will work. Sitting here, I don't have a solution that I can articulate in this segment of the podcast to tell you, if we only did this, if we only did that, we'd be able to curb this problem with crime. We'd be able to effectively reduce the social conditions that would instigate someone to commit crime. It's easy enough to say, well, if we had a stronger economy, there'd be less crime. That's true. That's a true statement. How do we create a stronger economy? A simple answer is we start manufacturing things here in the United States again. We reinvest in this country versus giving all of our money away to foreign countries. Hell, you could go into the fact that there's way too many markets that are monopolized by 1 or 2 or 3 companies in the United States. And within each one of those very small, innocuous statements, there could be hours-long debate on how to actually accomplish those things, even to the extent that those were viable solutions to the problem. No, dear listener, this isn't a segment where I illuminate all, where I reveal the secret to how we actually solve the problem of crime, inflation, recessions. I can tell you this, though. We can't go back to the same tired, weak, simple, fearful thought patterns that have led us to here, that have led us to this point, and blaming crime on anything but the downturn in the economy, the fact that inflation has skyrocketed, that we're headed into a recession, and that always leads to higher crime rates, and again, it always leads to higher mortality rates. People are going to start to die. People are going to die as a result of heading into a recession coupled with high inflation. We should all know which road we don't want to go down again, because we've been down those roads before.
Act 2. Hashtag vote against the incumbent.
Last week I did a piece on politics and I didn't publish it. And I actually came out and said, I'm debating what I'm trying to do here on this podcast, how many times I want to repeat myself, the things that I've said before in previous episodes. Do I want to be redundant? I understand that there's always the possibility that I'm going to invite new listeners into the podcast family, if you will, by putting stuff out on social media. Some people are going to come to it later than others. And as I've grown in my sophistication, I guess, about how the podcast community actually works, how podcasting audiences are developed, people can really enjoy your podcast and they'll listen to a few episodes, but many of them will not go back and listen all the way from beginning to end. And particularly when you've got 30, 60, 100 episodes, it's very difficult for someone to actually go back and listen to all that older content, keep up with the newer content, and still dabble in other podcasts. That's a minute-long way of me saying I'm going to repeat myself and I'm going to talk about politics in repeating myself. This episode of the podcast, episode 39, will be published on a Saturday, the Saturday before the election on November 8th, the year of our Lord 2022. As someone who watches a lot of live TV, because of sports, and coincidentally limited only to sports because that's really the only thing worth watching on live TV anymore, I have been subjected to many of the political advertisement on the television. I'm sure many of you who are listening, to the extent that you watch live television, have also been subjected to these ads. Even on your streaming services, if you don't pay the premium, I think Hulu is one of the examples. If you don't pay the premium to have no ads during the programming, you will also be subjected to political advertisements. I look forward to Election Day only because it's the end of this political ad cycle. There is no difference between the parties. Yes, I am repeating myself. There is no difference whatsoever between the political parties. You're not going to get anything different than you would if you had a Republican or a Democrat. At least the ads go away. That brings me to the point of the segment. Who are you going to vote for, dear listener? And I want to reiterate, because it does not matter, and because people claim that the country is in dire straits, what can we do in order to change what people perceive to be that trajectory? Let's take that as fact. Some of you may actually disagree that there are no differences in the political parties. Some of you may actually believe that there are differences and that actually translates to something by way of legislation. That is a debate for another segment. Let's take for granted, though, that there is no difference between the political parties. And be that as it may, what does one do in order to effectuate change if no matter who they vote for, they're going to get the same thing when that person goes to Washington, D.C.? It's very easy. It's very simple. You look up and down that ballot. On that ballot, it usually indicates who the incumbent is. And if it does not indicate who the incumbent is, you can very quickly find that out. It's a 6-year plan, dear listener. It's a short 6-year plan. In this election cycle, the year of our Lord 2022, when you go into that polling booth, you identify every one of the candidates that's an incumbent and you vote for the other person. In 2 years, there's going to be another election. And in 2 years, there's going to be a number of candidates that are going to be on the ballot, and there's going to be an I next to some of their names, that I denoting that they are incumbents. And you are going to vote against that incumbent. You are going to vote for every single person on that ticket that's running against an incumbent. For those loyal listeners, yes, there's going to be an election 2 years after that. And in that election, you are going to be invited to go and cast a ballot. And on that ballot, there will be names. And some of those names, that's right, they'll have an I next to the name. You are going to vote for the person that is running against that I. I am going to vote against that incumbent. And in that way, we are going to turn over practically the entire government in 6 short years. All of that money pouring into the elections, irrelevant. All of the influence being levied in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., moot. All of the bickering, all of the name calling, all of the identity politics, gone from the landscape. It's well within our power, dear listener. It's well within our power. It's one of the few messages that I've actually broadcast on this podcast that I believe so fervently in that I'm actually willing to go and push it on social media. This feeling of despair is almost comical in light of the fact that as individuals, we absolutely refuse to vote for people who will in any way, shape, or form disrupt the apple cart. How do I know that? Because you don't have anyone in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., in Congress, or in the White House who's willing to try to shake anything up. Okay, maybe you're going to throw one name at me, maybe you're going to throw another name at me. If you've got over 500 members of a legislative body and you can come out with 5 names, maybe 5 names, that's not a good percentage. If you're operating at 1% that's willing to upset the apple cart, that's not good. We absolutely and positively will not vote for someone who is going to go to Washington, D.C. and make any kind of change. Maybe that's a limitation of us. Maybe it's a limitation of the system. Maybe, just maybe, it's always been this way. Frankly, dear listener, it doesn't matter. None of that matters. When you actually understand the system and understand what's going on, why can't you, why can't I, why can't we collectively game the system? Who cares? Who cares who we're sending to D.C.? Who cares? If you want to effectuate change, if you want to strike fear into these legislators, into these politicians, the easiest way to do so is to just turn them over, turn their seats over. It doesn't matter whether or not you're a Democrat and you have a bunch of Republicans in your district running against the Democrats that you so dearly love. You have to turn over this polity in order to effectuate some sort of change, to get everyone to think it doesn't matter what I say in a political ad. It doesn't matter what I promise. If I can't contribute to legislative change, if I can't contribute to the betterment of this country, I'm going to get thrown out of office. Stop playing into the tribalism, dear listener. Stop playing into the politics. Stop playing particularly into the party politics. And here we get to the irony. Here we get to the complete and total paradox that is our political system. Here we are as a collective body, all agreeing on one very limited thing, that this isn't working, that something's wrong. Yet, when we actually look at what we believe to be wrong, it's not us. It's outside of us. It's the them, right? The them. Whether that them is the Republicans, whether that them is the Democrats, the liberals, the conservatives, corporatists, socialists, what have you. It's all window dressing. We can all get as frustrated as we want. The reality is that a lot of the things that we're holding on to so dearly when it comes to politics and our political system, it's a dog and pony show. If we want legislators representative of the legislated, if we want people responsive to the governed, how are we as the governed going to let them know as much? How can we express ourselves? It's very easy. Turn them over. Turn them over. Now, you, dear listener, as educated, as wise, as forward-thinking as you are likely saying to yourself, okay, what about the collective action problem? Great solution. Makes a ton of sense. Let's all go out and vote for the person who's running against the incumbent. In 6 years, we've turned over the entire government. Who's going to go first? Who's going to be the first person to do this? Who's going to be the person to build the momentum within the electorate so that not one person, not two, not 2,000, not 200,000, that everyone that goes out to the polls is going to vote for the person running against an incumbent, turn the government over, and we could start over again. That's where social media comes into play. And again, it's as foreign a concept to me, a foreign medium, one that I rarely navigate well, that's for sure. The answer is social media. We've already seen this over the course of the last 15 years with the prevalence of social media. The Arab Spring would not have occurred but for social media. The Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, regardless of what you think of any of these, they would not have had the momentum and the global reach that they did without social media. What do? How do I do this? Hashtag vote against the incumbent? Would that work? Well, dear listener, we're about to find out. I'm going to make a video. It's going to be for the Instagram, and I'm going to release it on the day that I release this podcast. That would be November 5th, 2022. Is it too late to influence the election? Yes, it is. Is a hashtag from a nobody that has very few followers going to catch on, going to have a lot of momentum? No, it is not. I'm playing the long game here, folks. The frustration is real. It's palpable. And there has to be something out there that can operate as an alternative versus just gnashing your teeth and going out and voting for the same types of candidates in the same types of elections with the same types of results. 6 years is not a long time to reform an entire government, and to do so in a peaceful, in a strategic manner. It is truly a bloodless coup only because the system is set up to allow as much. I'm going to rely on you, faithful following, to at least push the hashtag, if for nothing more than to point a finger at me and say, look at what this jackass is trying to do.
Act 3. The Ministry of Truth strikes back.
The Disinformation Governance Board is back. The Ministry of Truth rears its ugly head again. As you may recall, dear listeners, I did a piece, maybe two, on the Disinformation Governance Board, a government agency that's part of the Department of Homeland Security that reaches out to social media companies, to media outlets, and advises them, in their own words, makes recommendations about disinformation that is permeating the American media landscape. As it was quickly proven to be a complete and total farce, the principals who were involved in this were culprits of disinformation, had spread many a false narrative through their social media accounts, and what it appeared to be was an agency that was going to try to police speech in favor of certain political ends, certain administrative ends, to quell dissent, if you will. Strangely, as I noted at the time, the media, our corporate, our legacy media, was very comfortable with this agency, with its existence. Many of the op-eds by media members were in favor of having some sort of quote-unquote neutral arbiter of the truth. And tech companies had a strange relationship with this Disinformation Governance Board. Mark Zuckerberg came out and admitted that the Hunter Biden laptop story was de-emphasized, is probably the best way you could put it. In reality, Facebook did not allow that story to spread on its platform. It actually used its algorithm to hide that story. I do a lot of criticizing of the media on this podcast, and there's a lot of criticism of the media that's out there in the social media landscape. I do want to highlight a media outlet that I think is doing a good job at trying to illuminate some of these stories, and it's called The Intercept. You can type that into your Google machine quickly and it will come up. The Intercept. Like an interception in a football game, The Intercept. As a media outlet, they've done a number of really good stories on a number of different topics. The most recent that caught my attention, and the reason why I'm doing this piece, this segment, on episode 39 of the podcast, journalists, and I use that term intentionally, journalists at The Intercept came across a private or a secret, maybe even a confidential Department of Homeland Security memo that outlined the goals of this Disinformation Governance Board, illuminating the fact that it has not gone away, it has not been mothballed, it in fact is still active. It may not have the same name, it may not have the same principles, it may be housed in some other dark cubby of the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security bureaucracy, it still exists. The Disinformation Governance Board is looking to partner, and I use that term flippantly, partner with media outlets, particularly social media outlets, to educate them on disinformation concerning COVID, the efficacy of COVID vaccines, the attempts to discredit our elections or call them fraudulent, our withdrawal from Afghanistan, and other salient topics. One of the issues that's going to face anyone in the bureaucracy of the Department of Homeland Security, in the White House, any part of the government administration, it's the fact that the government has gotten so many things wrong over the course of the last 2 to 3 years when it comes to COVID. At best, dear listener, it's still an open question as to whether or not the COVID virus stemmed from a lab leak or it stemmed from some sort of open air market where people were buying and consuming bats. In my mind, it's a closed question. I believe it was a lab leak, that it's asinine to think that this virus stemmed from people buying bats in an open air market and consuming them. But I am not a scientist, and I am not an epidemiologist, and I don't have any expertise, more than any one of you, to have such an opinion. I do believe that the volume of evidence and my intuition as a cognizant, a conscious human being leads me to believe that if you go into a lab that is alleged to have had a leak and they basically say there was no leak here and we followed all the safety protocols and we're not going to let you tour the lab at all and you just have to take our word for it, and that's the story that's brought back to the public, not just in the United States but worldwide, that's how we validated that it was not a lab leak. Well, it was a lab leak. Look at how contentious that issue has been over the course of the lifespan of COVID. Do you want some sort of governmental body policing what is allowed to be discussed in public forums about the origins of COVID? Let's take that to the next iteration. Let's talk about the vaccine. President Biden rolls out a new vaccine. He is promoting it. He gets his shot on television. Everyone should go out and get the vaccine. Within the week, the University of Michigan and Columbia University publish a study that demonstrates through evidence, which of course has been completely disregarded in science when it comes to COVID over the last few years, with evidence that the new vaccine booster is no more efficacious in preventing the Omicron variant than the original vaccine. In other words, getting the booster does nothing more than getting the original shot, and if you've already gotten the original shot, getting the booster isn't going to provide you any more protection. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of why I believe the administration is pushing these vaccines so much. I can do another piece on that. The point here is clear. Do you want a governmental agency policing what can be discussed about the efficacy of these vaccines in light of the fact that there seems to be so much information out there as to whether or not they're effective, who should take them, and when? That brings me to the next point, the sanctity of elections, disinformation about whether or not elections were fraudulent or stolen. The legacy media in this country has selective amnesia when it comes to this whole election fraud, stolen election, stop the steal nonsense. The first person to proffer such, and I'll use the word, disinformation was one Hillary Clinton. This was all the Russians. The Russians hacked our elections, and that has been proven to be bullshit, and not only bullshit, but it was bullshit that was actually crafted and created by Clinton herself and her coterie of conspirators in order to discredit Donald Trump as a legitimate president of the United States. The mainstream, the legacy media, bought in hook, line, and sinker and pushed that for at least 2 years, if not the 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency. When Trump made the same type of claim, all of a sudden it was an existential crisis, one that actually threatened the very democracy that we live in. CBS recently did a poll, and this is actually making the rounds. If I've seen it, then I'm sure you've heard of it, dear listener. CBS News recently did a poll, and it asked a very simple question of a number of different types of voters. Would you rather have a strong economy or a functioning democracy? That question, in and of itself, reeks of disinformation. That you can have a strong economy or a functioning democracy, like you can't have both. And that somehow what's going on right now, the climate in the country threatens a strong democracy. You know, Tennessee plays Georgia in Athens this weekend. I had a buddy text me and ask me, would you rather have a hot threesome with two beautiful girls who were completely into that situation, or would you rather have Tennessee beat Georgia in Georgia? And my first thought was, why can't I have both? Why can't I have both? Why can't we have both a strong economy and a functioning democracy? What is it about having a functioning democracy that would threaten a strong economy or vice versa? This is the threat that we have with a disinformation governance board. As I've already pointed out, the media is completely biased, and that bias is towards power. And if the powers that be want there to be some sort of narrative, if you will, that the democracy is under threat and you have to vote one way or the other for one party or the other in order to support democracy, and it's not too difficult to figure out the powers that be that want us to believe that our democracy is under existential threat. The President of the United States himself, in an attempt to sway voters leading up to the midterm election on Tuesday, November the 8th, the year of our Lord 2022, went and made a speech, a national address, where it was basically democracy is under threat and your vote is going to directly influence whether or not we're going to continue to have a functioning democracy. That narrative in and of itself is disinformation. That so many people are upset at how the country is being run does not mean that democracy itself is under threat. What's under threat is the positions of power of a number of different types of stakeholders within politics, within media, particularly within social media. One of the revelations of the article in The Intercept that I found so interesting and that I believe shows how there really is no difference. There's no separation of power between private industry and government. There was an email that was leaked between a Microsoft executive and someone in this DHS Disinformation Governance Board, and it turns out that that executive from Microsoft had actually worked for the Department of Homeland Security, had made that transition, and was basically saying, I don't know why everybody's freaking out. They're going to have to get accustomed to the government getting involved in a private company's business in how it disseminates information. We may not be living in China. It may not be state-controlled media, but it's getting damn close. And again, I've said this many times, I really believe that the trajectory of humanity, of human consciousness, is on the rise, is going up. We can look at this like it's the end of the world, but it's not. We can actually look at it as the next evolution in our own independence, in our own independent thinking. When we can no longer trust mainstream and legacy media, when we can no longer even trust some of these private companies that are running the social media outlets. We stop looking for individual sources of information. We stop relying on the first thing that we hear to form our opinions. This is a good thing. And by word of mouth, we can actually identify outlets that are trying to honor a more traditional journalistic ethic. And I believe that The Intercept is one of those. You don't see any of the journalists on The Intercept on television that much. You don't see them wearing fancy clothes. You don't see them driving expensive cars. They don't have nice jewelry and nice watches. They're not sitting on these $1 million sets or working in $1 million penthouse offices. Journalism is a terrible profession to go into. It's just like teaching. You do it for the love of the work. Why? Because it doesn't pay to be a real journalist. Just like it doesn't pay to be a real teacher, it doesn't pay to be a real journalist. The cartoon characters that you see on your television are news actors and news actresses. They know what lines to read. They know what roles to play. They're obedient. A real journalist isn't obedient. I will endeavor, to the extent that I can find them, to talk about independent media outlets that I believe are actually bringing to the forefront journalism, news. They're actually breaking stories that are important to the evolution of not only democracy in this country, our relationship to one another, but our own independent decision making, how we actually come to the conclusions that we reach. Free will in the information that we consume and how it influences our decisions.
Act 4. Go Vols.
I'd be remiss if I didn't have a short segment on the University of Tennessee playing at Georgia, playing in Athens, number 1 versus number 3 in one poll, number 1 versus number 2 in another poll. I received some texts, I received some electronic mails about Tennessee being ranked number 1, and although nice in this day and age, to me it wasn't that big of a deal. With the college playoff, with the way the schedules are now set up, you play your way into number 1. It doesn't matter what week you were ranked number 1 unless that week is the last week of the season, unless that week is the night that you're playing in the national championship game. It's nice recognition for the program. It's nice recognition for the head coach, Josh Heupel, that he's gotten the team to a point where they could even be ranked number 1. Many people, including me, did not expect as much, certainly not this soon, certainly not ever. Even under Philip Fulmer in the days when Tennessee was ranked routinely in the top 10, if not top 5, Fulmer always had his Mount Everest, the hurdle that it was very difficult for him to travail, and he's a big man. He doesn't jump over many hurdles. That one was called Steve Spurrier. Given that Tennessee would play Florida, and still does play Florida, very early on in the season, many a top 5 ranking was spoiled by one Steve Spurrier. It's been a hot minute since Tennessee's been ranked number 1, and that's probably going to help recruiting. It's probably going to help with the prestige that is necessary in today's day and age to pay the prime athletes, to get boosters, to get alumni, to help support financially these NIL contracts, these endorsement contracts for the likeness that these athletes now have. Will that help the number 1 ranking, the prestige, the recruiting? Will that help at the University of Georgia today, the year of our Lord, November 5th, 2022? No, it will not. No, it will not. Georgia has a stout, if not vaunted, defense. It is truly strength upon strength, Georgia's defense versus Tennessee's offense. If Tennessee can actually hold Georgia's offense to what is, for them, a reasonable output, which is probably 300 yards, Tennessee can win that football game. I will not belabor the point, as I know if Tennessee does win that football game, Fanboy will have plenty of things to say next week on episode 40 of the podcast. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.